Okay, I think we'll just start now. It's a few minutes after 5. So welcome everybody to tonight's event, and thanks to CRER for hosting tonight's event for Black History Month. My name's Zandra Yeaman and I'm the curator of Discomfort at the University of Glasgow's Hunterian. And it's a real privilege to introduce our 3 speakers tonight. So we've got Dr. David Alston, is a historian and author who has been researching Scotland's links to the slave trade for more than 2 decades. He also previously served as deputy leader of Highland Council and as chairman of NHS at Highland. We have Dr. Callie Kehoe, who is the Canada Research Chair in Atlantic Canada Communities. Callie's primary research areas are religion, migration and minority identities in the North Atlantic, but she's also interested in sustainable development and rural change in Nova Scotia and the Scottish Highlands. And then we have Dr. Stephen Mullen, historian at the University of Glasgow and co-author of Slavery, Abolition, the University of Glasgow Report, which led to the sector-leading reparative justice strategy. So the 3 speakers are going to present their papers. And what I ask is, if you look in the chat, you'll see the opportunity for you to actually put some questions forward to the panel. But what I'd ask is if we listen to all the 3 speakers, and then if you post your questions, I'll put them to the panel once we're finished. So without further ado, because you're here to see the speakers and not me, David, if you want to start off, please.
Thanks very much, Sandra, and thank you for that introduction. I've just published Slaves and Highlanders, which is the result of that research that I've been doing over 20 years. So anybody can go online and have a look at that, see what the contents are. A lot of what I'm doing in that book, I think the technical term would be micro-histories. And I think the best way to explain what I'm doing and give you a sense of it is by example. So what I want to do in this 10 minutes is to talk about 2 enslaved Africans, whose names are Pompey and Archie. And this relates to events that happened in Berbice on the north coast of South America in early 1814. They were events which at least were interpreted by the very small white population in Berbice, a very Scottish, very Highland white population, as plans for an uprising. That led to executions, floggings, branding and banishment of a number of slaves, and more than 100 enslaved people were interrogated, and from these interrogations we can learn quite a lot. So at Christmas in 1813, the previous year, Pompey, and that's obviously not his real name, it's a name he's been given once he's enslaved. He's an enslaved Mandingo, and he's become the head driver on Plantation Washington, which really belonged to William Monroe, who came from Easter Ross. And at Christmas, Pompey said, and I'm quoting him, "No new Negroes now come to the country. So we must take care of ourselves and do that story." Now, when he says no new Negroes come to the country, he's talking about, from an enslaved person, talking about the end of the transatlantic African slave trade. And although I've been studying this for a long time, that perspective had not occurred to me, that for the enslaved 6 years after, this is a moment of isolation. Nobody new is coming from Africa. And Pompey says, so we must take care of ourselves. And when you begin to look at that in detail and look at what other enslaved people are saying, they mean that they must gather together in what they call their nations, as Congos, as Coromantes, as Papa. And these are not simple African ethnicities, it's a bit more complicated than that, but there's certainly a sense, and perhaps an emerging sense of ethnicities among the enslaved. So they must keep together in these groups, and they must do that story. And this phrase keeps coming up, the story, where it began, how it spread, what it means. And what it seems to mean is that in these groups, they must choose leaders. They call them leaders in imitation of the colony structure. They call them governors and fiscals. They must care for the sick. They must settle their own disputes among themselves. And very importantly, they must bury the dead with feasting and with proper ritual. And there's also a lot of emphasis on dancing and on what they call play. And then what's a bit disputed in the testimony is, but it probably also means they must rise up. They must revolt. And people say Archie of Mr. Fraser's first began the story. Archie's African born, and he's an enslaved servant to James Fraser of Belladrum. James Fraser of Belladrum in the Highlands, but James Fraser and his two brothers are plantation owners in Berbice, where there's also a Belladrum. Archie is from what's now the Ivory Coast, and he's described in various ways, but mainly as a Coromantee. And he's been, according to a number of people who give evidence, he's been in England. Now, I think that means Britain. And I think it's very likely that Archie has been to Scotland with James Fraser, and that he's been to Belladrum in the Highlands. And he's returned just before Christmas. Then what happens is that he either declares himself, or he's chosen not just as governor, but as king of the Coromantees. Others describe him as a great man on the west coast. And he's brought back with him a patchwork quilt, which he displays, exhibits. He's dressed a bit differently, presumably because he's been a house servant. Sometimes he wears a cockade in his hat and carries a broad white flag. And on quite a number of occasions around Christmas, he feasts and he dances with Coromantee people, not just at the plantation where he works, Trafalgar, but at Bran, which is nearby, and at other plantations. All of this leads to the feeling that there is about to be an uprising. The white authorities step in. 6 enslaved men, including Pompey, are found guilty and executed by hanging. They're then decapitated. Their bodies are buried on an island in the Berbice River in unmarked graves, so they can't be retrieved by friends and family. And their heads are displayed on spike poles on the plantations on which they worked. Archie was found guilty, but by a majority verdict, because James Fraser of Belladrum didn't agree. And he was sentenced, so he escaped death. He was sentenced to flogging, followed by banishment. And James Fraser initially suggests that he will exile him to Scotland. The governor of the colony steps in, doesn't find that acceptable, and so Archie ends up in Grenada, and James Fraser of Belladrum received compensation of 1,500 florins, which is about £120. So from the lives of Archie, and to some extent in Pompey, in what is a very Scottish, very Highland part of the British Caribbean colonies, we can see something of the lives of the enslaved, but also of what's going on of the interaction, the entanglement of that with Scotland. I know I've talked about 2 men, and just very briefly, can I say that just a little bit further down the coast of Berbice, on the east coast on Plantation Alness, which belongs to another Munro, a George Munro from Alness in the Highlands, there is a young 18-year-old woman called Susanna. She has already borne 3 sons to George Munro, the firstborn when she was probably just 12 or 13 years old. These 3 boys go on to attend Marischal College in Aberdeen, and Susanna, who becomes free, lives until the 1850s. She never learns to read or write, but she makes a will which is registered in England, in which she instructs her executors to pursue the inheritance which was due to her sons and which was never paid by George Munro of Alness. So another example of agency and of a quite surprising, I like the word entanglement, of the lives of the enslaved and what's happening in the north of Scotland, in the Highlands of Scotland. There's a lot more in the book, but I'll stop there because I hope that gives a flavour of some of the approach that I'm taking.
Thanks very much, David. I'm going to just share my screens if you'll bear with me just for a second. I hope that works for everybody. It's really nice to be joining you in Scotland today, and maybe if we get the pandemic under control, I'll be able to get over there again in real life. I'm Carly Kehoe, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Highland Catholics actually and the colonial legacies. And so I'll talk to you about the research that I'm working on now, but how it evolved. It actually started, this work for me started in 2010 when I discovered with my colleague, Andrew Nichol, a journal by an Irish Catholic seaman. And that journal was actually held in Fort Augustus at the Benedictine monastery. And when I was working at UHI at the time, I was really curious, why was this journal in the Highlands, and why was this Irish Catholic surgeon talking about the West African Squadron and boarding ships full of enslaved people, and what was going on, what were the connections. As I started looking at into it a little bit more, I started realizing that there were an awful lot of links between the Highlands and the Caribbean, and also plantation enslavement. And so I got in touch with Inverness Royal Academy and the history teacher there, John Quigley, and we developed a program for the history pupils, the S5 and S6 history pupils. And we worked with the Highland Archive Centre, and we brought together resources from the school and the Highland Archive Centre to come up with this really neat little booklet, actually, for school pupils to use. And I remember when I approached the Highland Archives to help me, they were really wonderful, and they said, absolutely, but we don't think we'll have very much material. But what ended up happening was, with the project Landscapes and Lifescapes, they actually started looking into their collections, and they found an awful lot of stuff. And so this was one of the really important partnerships in my work. Then when I moved over to Canada in 2016, I was really interested in Scottish Highland settlement because I'm from Cape Breton, and I'm working in Nova Scotia. And so there's a very strong Highland connection between the two places. But I was really, really curious because I wanted to know how the links were triangulated. I wanted to know how the Highlands were connected with the Caribbean and how they were connected with Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. And so I started to look at Highland settlements and realized that even in tiny, tiny Cape Breton places, in these very remote villages, there was a heavy dependency on trade, north-south trade. And that trade was linking these very small settlements, sometimes of 10 people, 16 people, with different islands in the Caribbean. They were sending fish, salt fish down and bringing molasses rum up. And then, because I'm a historian who really does focus on Catholic settlement and Catholics, the Scottish Catholic dimension, I wanted to understand how the Scottish Catholic settlements here started getting up and running. And what I discovered was that the first mass Scottish Highland Catholic settlement was actually established in Prince Edward Island, and it was in 1772, and part of it was enabled by money that had been earned in Jamaica. And so for me, that was the link that I knew was there, but I needed to find it. And the first image that you're seeing on the screen here is a really important one. And it's just in Arisaig up in the Northwest Highlands. And it's meant, I think it's the house of Golden Sandy. And he's known in the region as a man who had earned a fortune in Jamaica and then came back and displayed his wealth. So in case there are those of you who maybe aren't that familiar with Atlantic Canada, this is it. But the two circles that you'll see, one is Prince Edward Island, the little one, and that's roughly where the settlement was, the Glenaladale settlement, and that was largely Scottish Highland Catholic, not exclusively, but largely. And then the reason why I have drawn another circle is that's Cape Breton Island, and a number of the people who went to the Glenaladale settlement in Prince Edward Island didn't end up being so happy there, and many of them actually migrated secondarily to Cape Breton and eastern Nova Scotia. And so that's just to give you a sense of where this is in the world. So quickly, Golden Sandy, John MacDonald and the Glens. This is based on an article that just came out in the Scottish Historical Review, and it's work I've been doing for a couple of years now, and it's actually going to form the basis of my next monograph. But it sort of centers around this relationship between two cousins, Alistair and Nora, Golden Sandy, and John MacDonald. They were the sons of prominent Jacobite families. Golden Sandy was actually of the Baroradale MacDonalds in the Northwest Highlands. And the interesting thing about him is that he migrated to Jamaica just on the eve of the Jacobite Rising in 1745. We don't really know why he went. It could have been for any range of reasons, but what we do know is that he was there for about 30 years and he earned a huge fortune. Part of the money will have definitely come from his first wife, who predeceased him. She has been someone I've been trying to track down information upon, but I've really been only able to find out her name, Mrs. Handyside. And there were rumors that she had 2 children before she married Golden Sandy. So a bulk of his wealth seemed to have come from her, and he inherited it upon her death, but then he also earned his own money. And so he decided to return to the Highlands, like many of them did, to show off their wealth in the early 1770s. And he wanted land, but he also wanted title. Now, his first cousin, and his cousin is the one who's known much more in Atlantic Canada, is John MacDonald, who was 8th of Glenaladale. He was a frustrated tacksman like so many, and he wanted to get out of Scotland. He didn't feel there was a future for him there. And so he purchased land in Prince Edward Island and was intent on setting up a settlement there for a number of Scottish Highland Catholics and others, but Scottish Highland Catholics who had been put under pressure to convert to Presbyterianism. He wanted basically to set up shop in Prince Edward Island as a landowner with people under him. So he didn't really want to change that much. He just wanted his status back. What he didn't realize is that when you set up any kind of settlement in Atlantic Canada at that time, and it wasn't called Atlantic Canada, it costs a lot of money, and he was terrible with money, and he was overextended and he needed cash. And the only way he could figure out to raise it was to sell the Glens, and he had title to Glenaladale, the Glenaladale and Glenfinnan estates. And so he had kind of put off offers on that land because, from what I gather, he was waiting for the right connection, because one of the things about this family is they were of the old Highland Catholic elite. And part of the reason Catholicism survived in this region was because of them. And so my sense is that he was waiting for a Catholic relative, a loyal Catholic relative who he could sell to. And that person was Alexander Golden Sandy. He established himself, and Sandy went on to purchase an awful lot of land in the Highlands, the West Highlands. He died, I think, in 1790, I could get that date wrong, and his fortune was inherited by his son, who then basically drank it away. But what he also did, his son, was he commissioned the Glenfinnan Monument, and that will be something that you're all familiar with, hopefully. So this work, that's a quick snapshot. And also, if there's anybody on this who doesn't have access to the Scottish Historical Review or is up against a paywall, if you don't work in a university, send me an email and I'll send you the PDF. But I wanted to talk about this briefly, just to give you a sense of what I'm trying to do with this research. So in the bigger picture, how do I see it mattering? What am I trying to do? Fundamentally, what I'm trying to do is expand our understandings of the constituencies of Britain's imperial program, because I want to connect Scottish Highland Catholics with the colonial enterprise. When it comes to the Caribbean, it's hard to find them, but they're definitely there. And this is an example of how we can locate them. I'm also wanting to correct the tendency to perceive the British Empire as Protestant. It wasn't. And there were an awful lot of Scots Catholics and Irish Catholics who were deeply invested in the program of empire. And the reason I'm doing this is because I feel that it broadens the scope of complicity in understanding the process of colonization and who was involved with it and at what levels. What I'm also trying to do is establish a framework that helps us to see how Scotland's culture of structural and systemic anti-Catholicism accelerated the process of settler colonialism. This is a big thing. I spent 16 years in Scotland, and so on this front, I do believe there needs to be more attention to what anti-Catholicism actually did in terms of expanding Scotland's stake in the empire. What is the effect? Well, and these pictures you're seeing are looking from the Glenfinnan Monument down the loch, by the way. But the effect is, I think what this kind of work helps us to do is it helps us to complicate and disrupt traditional perspectives of the Scottish Highland diaspora in Canada and Atlantic Canada. Coming back taught me that we don't really appreciate how complicated and complex that diaspora actually has been. It can often be wrapped up and kind of in a neat and tidy box, and it's usually celebrated. But there are so many levels to this, and I think that Canadian researchers certainly need to get our teeth into this. It's also revealing the depth of the reliance on the money earned in the Caribbean. So you'll recall that I talked about those tiny settlements dotted around Cape Breton Island. Many of them, by the way, were squatter settlements. People didn't actually have title to the land, but they had a huge reliance on that north-south trade and on their connections that came with them from Scotland that linked them to the Caribbean. So I'm trying to reveal the depth of this reliance and also understand its role in supporting the extension of Scottish Catholicism and Highland culture to Canada. That settlement in PEI actually established a really solid foundation for Scottish Catholicism in Canada, that has been powerful and is still very powerful to this day. So there's a legacy there as well. But I also am doing this because I think we need to flag that there are two Highland pasts at play. And sometimes in Atlantic Canada, that one of these pasts can get sidestepped. There was the colonized dimension, but also the colonizer dimension. And I don't believe that these pasts can be reconciled, even though there are arguments that they can be. I do not believe that they can. Now, this picture is actually of Cape Breton Island, and this is the Cape Breton Highlands it's called Big Interval, but it's in the Margaree River Valley where I'm actually from. And what you're looking at is land that was granted to Scots, Highland Scots, in the middle of the 19th century. But there are legacies here. Many people in Canada, you'll see this, but not enough, are starting to understand that there cannot be reconciliation without truth. And reconciliation is being pushed very, very hard here, and rightly so by our Indigenous peoples. The legacy of Highland settlement in Atlantic Canada is extremely complex, and work like this helps us to understand some of that. It is entangled with the Caribbean, it's entangled with the enslavement of Black Africans, as well as the widespread displacement of the Mi'kmaq, which is our region's Indigenous people. And actually, I should have started with a land acknowledgement, but I'm speaking to you today from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. All of this work is feeding into a project that I'm doing called the Catholic Atlantic, where my colleague and I, Sharon O'Neill and Trinity in Dublin, are trying to understand just the role that Catholics played in colonization. But I'm going to stop there just because I could go on about this forever. So thanks very much. And I'll just stop my sharing. Okay. Over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak alongside friends and colleagues over many years. So I think I'm here to speak about the Highlands and Caribbean slavery, and I think that there's probably enough historiography now of Scottish Highlands and Caribbean slavery to describe it as really a distinctive field of Scottish history. The major debate, like Scotland more broadly, is economic nature, and I think it really concerns, the extent to which slavery and its commerce shaped the development of the Scottish Highlands. So in 1988, Alan McInnes could describe the Highlands as an internal colony of Britain, rather than a beneficiary of empire like the industrialised lowlands. But within 10 years, McInnes described Highland landlords as active members of the imperial exploiting classes, as planters, slave traders, colonial officials, military commanders, merchant adventurers. So in this 1998 paper, McInnes really traced the Malcolms of Pocatellock, how they siphoned profits from Jamaican slavery through London to improve estates in Argyll. McInnes really pioneers the capital inflow model from Caribbean slavery to the Scottish Highlands. So there is no doubt that Gaels really fully participated in the exploitation of enslaved people in the British West Indies, and at least some of this wealth found its way back to the Scottish Highlands. So McInnes's comments, this 1998 comment provides a nice summary of the complexities of the Highlands' economic connections with Caribbean slavery, and I shall flag up four. Firstly, we have Highland gentry capitalist families who sometimes owned estates, slave plantations in the West Indies. Second of all, we had temporary economic migrants known as sojourners who went to the Caribbean with the hope of quick wealth and a rapid return. Thirdly, there was industries like hemp manufactories, herring fisheries, and they were part of a wider Atlantic slave economy that employed local populations. Fourthly, there's a few West India merchant firms and the co-partners would have invested merchant capital across the region. So tonight I'll address 1 and 2, that as elite families and sojourning wealth. And this is mostly where my own research is focused over the last decade and more. So David Alston, his outputs have definitely transformed how we understand the role of Highland Scots in the Dutch-British colonies of Berbice, Demerara and Essequibo. David's 2004 article, posed the question about very rapid and splendid fortunes. And David has cited what he's later described as chit-chat. There was a Bella Drum who was supposedly have made £40,000 by one trip. I mean, if that had really happened, that would have been certainly a splendid fortune. It would have been huge, given that the Scottish Midland ranks in the 19th century were worth an average of about £5,000 in death. But I think it's often forgotten, not by David, but by others, that comment was made by the Highland landlord and faux humanitarian, Lord Seaforth. Finlay McKitting's work in 2018 really showed how Seaforth tried to ruthlessly exploit enslaved people in the hope of improving his ancestral estates. He earned the exact opposite of a splendid fortune, and in the process, he lost the ancestral estates. So it may be that Seaforth is much more representative of the Highland Planters than the Malcolms of Pocatellock. And we also know that even those Highland Planters that really did accumulate great slavery wealth, this money that was coming in, sometimes it could contribute, it could disrupt rather than contribute to the development of local society. The work of Ian McKinnon and Andrew McKillop, they've recently identified 60 estates purchased in the British West Indies, in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland by individuals rich from the profits of slavery in the period 1790-1855. This capital influx meant estates covered 1.2 million acres of land, approximately 1/3 of the region. I mean, this is huge. The study did 2 important things. Firstly, it corrected the colonial myopia in T.M. Devine's The Great Highland Famine, which, whilst acknowledging there was a new Highland elite formed after 1800, the implications of having made their fortunes in trade, and that's a quote, was not explored. But secondly, this study argues that the influx of this new slavery elite had no connection to the land or traditional agricultural methods, and it was detrimental since the new owners cleared many thousands of Highland tenants from land they had lived on for centuries. And we know that they introduced, of course, enterprise such as sheep farming. In other words, the inflow of slavery-derived capital had a detrimental rather than positive economic effect in local society. But I would say that this vision of rapid and splendid Highland sojourning wealth has prevailed. Douglas Hamilton's 2005 book used case studies to show the investment in cotton mills, schools, and hospitals. David Alston was actually much more sceptical in an excellent 2016 article on behavioural economics, and David's arguing that there was the perception of wealth that these sojourners went out and very few of them succeeded. But we haven't up till now been able to actually measure how many of these sojourners actually earned, how many of them were successful, and where did the money go. Carly's work in 2016, Carly Kehoe's work, noted the importance, however, of charitable enterprise by these West India sojourners. The money went into schools and hospitals, and therefore the profits of Caribbean slavery improved the wealthy families, but it also percolated across society. And perhaps even I was guilty myself of endorsing the splendid fortunes thesis, because looking back, I should have been probably much more sceptical about the representative of John Lamont's fortune on a paper in 2018. It was a huge fortune, and it was a single case study. I never had comparisons at the time, and perhaps I should have been much more cautious how wildly unrepresentative that John Lamont is. But I would say at the moment, the current thinking is there was big fortunes made by Highland sojourners, and it percolates across the region. So in this sense, David Alston's work, Slaves and Highlanders, is a seminal moment. And there's been some recent political commentary around about it. On 30th of September, David has really called for the Scottish Government to take responsibility and incorporate an agreement for Caribbean reparations as part of any independence campaign. This is probably a moral argument rather than legal or political, since we know that the British state under Tony Blair and New Labour in 2001, they introduced legal barriers. But I think important to David's argument here, there was a trickle-down effect in Highland society. And I quote David, asking who benefited from slavery is like asking who benefited from North Sea oil. Incidentally, I do think that there's a case for this in the central lowlands, but that's for another day. So David's work is really, he particularly rebuts Michael Fry's argument that Edinburgh had limited involvement with the Caribbean slave trade. And David invokes the McKinnon and MacKillop paper by drawing attention to how culpability and complicity spread throughout the region. But my reading of the conclusions of this paper is different, as opposed to concluding culpability and complicity. The conclusion, and I quote, the wealth generated from slavery facilitated estate purchases, which, and I quote here, impacted upon the region in ways that worked against many of its already vulnerable communities. So we do know from McKinnon and MacKillop's work that this new slavery elite purchased these landed estates. Many of them became leading proponents of the Highland Clearances, a process which has had long-term negative effects in the region, and much of which remains underdeveloped today. McKinnon and MacKillop have estimated that this new slavery elite cleared around 5,000 people, Highland tenants, from the land, and we think this is a vast underestimate. In other words, if there's any trickle-down effect at all, it was amongst the chosen few. And this has got implications because we know from Alex Renton's recent book, Blood Money, he's advocated elite families pay a form of reparations. So I think only the sojourner in my own work and an imminent monograph, The Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy, I've arrived at some new conclusions about Scots in the West Indies. There are no immigration records to really assess how many departed for the Caribbean before 1840, but I've arrived at new estimates that between 37,000 and 47,000 Scots departed between 1750 and 1834. An informed estimate suggests Highlanders could have been about 20% of that. And if we think that the Highland proportion of the Scottish population in 1801 was about 18% of 1.6 million. So I would say that I'm gently saying that the Highland proportion outwards was overrepresented, and it's not a controversial conclusion, given we know that many Highlanders departed after the first phase of clearance post 1745. Those who actually departed, these Scots who left, were skilled young men, trained sometimes in accountants, probably a lot of tradesmen, and definitely those a lot with agricultural experience. Most never returned. Modern estimates for Demerara and Jamaica suggest 90% would have died within 3 years, certainly before they would have managed to repatriate wealth of any great significance. So I've been able to do in my work is trace 140 confirmation inventories of Scots who were on 3 islands, Grenada, Jamaica and Trinidad. This is money that they have already repatriated to Scotland. It's their wealth on death. And it confirms about £1 million of slavery-derived capital. The average then is about 7,500, but I should say it's vastly skewed with big fortunes. The third of the group left less than £500. The bigger story of Scots in the Caribbean is, of course, premature death. The 10% who survived would have accumulated low to medium returns in a high-risk environment. And I would say within this big picture here, the repatriation or lack thereof of Highland West India fortunes is quite startling. For around 14% of the £1 million come back to the Highlands, but this doesn't tell the real story. Just 6% of the inventories could be connected to Scots with family residencies in the Highlands, yet they were large scale. Of the overall wealth repatriated to the Highlands, about 70% went to one elite family, the Lamonts of Knockdown. So what we're seeing here, we've been able to see rapid and splendid fortunes were certainly unrepresentative, yet the perception of mainly unrealisable wealth would have perpetuated the outward flow of lower ranked migrants, which to me contributed to underdevelopment. With hindsight, of course, these young men should have went to the west of Scotland's cotton mills. So I think previous accounts, including my own work and John Lamont, about the economic effects of slavery in the Highlands suffer from a survival bias and certainly a lack of a comparative framework of repatriated wealth. To me, this means, and I'm speaking about Lamont here, a wildly unrepresentative example of large-scale wealth might be perceived as typical. Caribbean sojourning, to me, initiated the loss of many thousands of skilled young men year after year after year. This group deserve no sympathy. That's not the point of the paper. But I think to me, it's becoming clear that Caribbean slavery contributed to the development of some Scottish regions, whilst the departure of skilled sojourning labour contributed to the development of others, particularly and notably the Scottish Highlands. And I'm certainly with Carly and the cash-rich Highlanders with the slavery-derived wealth from Jamaica, the maritime provinces, was probably a regular destination. So I think in applying Eric Williams' famous thesis, Capitalism and Slavery, in a Highland context, I think a differentiation is required about individual profiteering amongst Gaels from the wider structural development of the Highlands, or lack thereof. I would suggest that the Highlands was the Scottish region least developed by the processes around Caribbean slavery. We know that these new slavery elites cleared many thousands of people, which to me disrupts the trickle-down effect in local societies and arguably set in place inequalities that perpetuated underdevelopment. Most of the outward bound were never seen again, and I suggest from the work I've been doing that the post-mortem return of wealth was rare indeed. I take no position here on the view that devolved Scotland should enter into negotiations for state-to-state reparations as part of any independence strategy. I'm simply providing an interpretation of the historical evidence and trying to map that to the current political and legal realities. If the case for reparations is partly based on the principle of inheritors of a space improved via the exploitation of enslaved labour, the elite families that today remain in situ, that historically profited from enslavement and simultaneously clear local societies, then surely they must be watching the developing moral case for reparations with great interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for three great papers. David, talking on a personal level about Archie from the Ivory Coast and his relationship with James Fraser, I thought was really interesting, actually hearing someone talking about someone specifically, which is not always the case, as we know. And Carly, I like that, and posing that question about being colonised or the colonisers, which I think is an ongoing debate in Scotland, actually, especially when we're looking at a lot of this history from an anti-racist perspective. So quite like us to elaborate a wee bit more on that. And Stephen, the imperial systems follow the money, which is always a good idea when we're looking at these topics. But before we open up to questions to the audience, and please, anyone who's present here today, if you want to ask our panel, you've got an opportunity here with 3 experts on a panel to ask them any questions that you want around their papers. Please do. If you put it in the chat box, then I can pose these questions to them. But one of the things, this is a good thing about being chair, you get to ask the first question. And I'd spoke to you briefly about this before, and obviously I've been reading a lot of the work that you have passed forward to me, the work that you are involved in. And it really made me think about growing up in Scotland and our history. And well, you know, tonight we have 3 academics, all been to university. Not everybody has access to university and further and higher education, therefore not getting access to this level of Scottish history, you know, Scotland's Black history. And it reminded me of when I was a child at school and we talked about Scotland's history, and we did get told about Highland Clearances, but it was through the lens of Consider the Lilies, you know, that book, Ian Crichton Smith. And there was nothing about racial slavery or even anything around plantation economies or Scotland's links to the Caribbean. How important do you think it is for young people, you know, through secondary education, well, primary right through, to learn these elements of Scotland's history? I'll start with you first, David.
I think it's extremely important because I think if we're looking at Scottish history, I think there's a long period where, to pick up some Stephen's points, even if money is not being made, the lure of money being made, the potential of money being made, is having a profound effect on Scottish society. And Scots and Highland Scots are out there doing terrible things, and having a dreadful impact across the world. I think we need to know about that, and I think we need to recognise that it's a shared history. It's not just our history. So we need to explore it. So I think that's why why the 3 of us with connections, with different connections with the Highlands of Scotland, are here doing it. But we need to do that. We need to find ways of doing that more in cooperation with others for whom it's also their history. And we need to make the resources that are often in our archives available, because that's the source for the histories of the ancestors of so many millions of people across the globe. Absolutely.
Carly, what's your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are interesting, and I'm recalling an incident it's not really an incident, but it's a memory from when I was in primary school, or just starting secondary school. And where I'm from, it's Inverness County, right? So this is, it's got a lot of Scottish connections. But the teacher in that class said that one of our activities that day was going to be, we had to draw our family tartan. And I have no Scottish blood in me. I'm actually Irish and French, like Acadian. And there was a girl in my class who put up her hand and she said, I'm half Black and I don't have this. And the teacher kind of looked shocked and didn't really know what to do with that. But I have thought about it so many times over the years, because you grow up in a place like Inverness County, you don't even stop to think that there are other identities all around you that get no space. And so one of the things that I would really love to see, and I think the Scottish curriculum is doing that, but kids, young people, students, the ones I teach at university, and colleagues on this panel and in the viewers deck, we have a responsibility to broaden our minds a little bit and say, what we've been doing doesn't go far enough. It doesn't include all of the constituencies. Who do we need to bring to the table to talk about what we are and who we are?
Mm-hmm. Stephen, have you got your thoughts on this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, absolutely. I think, I'm interested in economic development in Scotland and how Caribbean slavery, powered. Scotland's one of the poorest nations. Western Europe, 1690, the Union happened 1707. Then huge influx of wealth, the Atlantic trades, as well as capital, really shaping Scotland's industrial revolution. So I think we can start answering questions for school children today why is Scotland, part of the imperial core, Great Britain? Why is it a developed society? Why do we have, big major universities, museums? Why is Scotland part of the developed world? And conversely, why is areas like Jamaica and where Scots were? Well, I'm interested in the extraction of wealth for the Caribbean and just really how it powered Scotland. And I think it's important for children just to know that trajectory.
No, and when you think about even present day, the idea that we're so removed, how did we manage to keep ourselves as a nation removed from our complicity in this history, if we're not actually teaching it from early years onwards, which I think is really important. The good thing is I don't need to ask you any more questions because the audience who've came tonight have put loads of questions in here for you. So I'm just going to go through all these questions. Does that work for everybody? And feel free. Some are directed, but I'd be happy for everybody to jump in and discuss and answer them. So there's a question here from Benjamin who said, can you say some more about the relationship between Episcopalians and Catholics? It seems to me that Scottish Tories, often Episcopalians, were very sympathetic to Catholics and the Jacobite cause and supported those families that had been disenfranchised after Culloden and helped them to gain positions in the British colony. So I think that I'll start with you, Carly, with that one.
What I would ask, that's a huge question. And you can write to me separately because it's probably not something that I could answer quickly. Please write to me, Ben. I'll get on that.
There you are, Ben. And David, with this enslaved people who were executed for planning a rebellion have been given a fair trial?
No, but I think it's interesting that they were given a trial and people devote an enormous amount of effort to going through that process of interrogation and trial. So they clearly, and this is the white planters in the colony, they clearly feel that they're doing something that they either have to do or they want to do. And that results in this really fascinating archive and revealing archive where, it's mediated through the processes of the court, but you are still hearing the voices of the enslaved and to some extent their version of events. So no, not a fair trial.
And this is a great question. Carly, you had touched on dispossession of Indigenous people. So this is for everyone, actually, asking all of you about Indigenous people in this, who part of this history. For instance, the complications in Demerara, for sure. So thinking about the dispossession of Indigenous people through this vile trade.
Can I go first on that? Some very quick comments.
Yeah.
One of the things I've looked at in the book is not just the dispossession, but the ethnic cleansing of the Caribs of St. Vincent, and Highland Scots are very much involved in that. The initial Dutch contacts with Demerara and Berbice are very much based on the idea that they will trade with Indigenous peoples, and that very quickly becomes a slave economy. But the plantations in Guyana are created from the coast, and one Guyanese of African ancestry made a very interesting comment to me. We're the Indigenous people of the coast because we created it. We dug this. It's one of the major engineering works of the early 1800s. On my estimate, the equivalent of digging 300 Caledonian canals, but done entirely with enslaved labour and without the aid of the steam dredger they had in Loch Ness.
Carla, do you want to elaborate a bit more?
Yeah, so I have a book coming out in February, and it's called Empire and Emancipation. And there's a chapter in that book about the Catholic Church's relationship with enslavement. And it was very interesting because it did not condemn the enslavement of Black Africans, but it did condemn the enslavement of Indigenous peoples on the islands because it felt that they could be converted. And so that was really interesting when you have the Catholic Church, which was actually extremely powerful in a lot of those islands, because the majority of enslaved people, and some of them like Trinidad, were Catholic. So you have almost like the church pitting itself against the empire and saying, the indigenous peoples, we can convert them, so leave them alone. But that isn't really what happened in reality, as we all know.
Mm-hmm. Stephen?
Yeah, well, I spent a month in Trinidad in research in 2016. And with my dear friend, Owen Cujo, we went to Arima, which is the home of the Indigenous community of Trinidad. It's a first community. And Selwyn, over his long academic career, he had produced a number of documents about the early history of, colonisation of Trinidad, and he had produced some of the early, these were incredibly rare to the modern Indigenous community. And it really changed my entire vision of, how I viewed the Caribbean and the modern legacies. And really, this is part of the Reparations Campaign. It was dispossession of Indigenous people, first of all, before enslavement. And there are very few communities here today, but it certainly should be part of it. It's part of the entire discussion. It's absolutely dispossession and expropriation of land, and then the forced trafficking of African people to produce. And British and Scottish have got a role. English and Scottish, I should say.
It's interesting because it is. Sorry, Carly.
It was just to add to that, because that settlement or the Indigenous community in Trinidad, it was actually a Catholic mission station, and they funded the school there by selling liquor. Wow. And that's exactly what they did in Canada, in parts of Canada. The colonial officials and traders would find ways to give liquor or sell liquor as a trade item to make people less able to to assert their rights. And so that is replicated, and that's specifically targeting Indigenous.
And it's what I was going to say, what's interesting in Scotland when we're exploring these histories, and I see even within museums, when we're looking at things around oceanic collections, there's still so many issues with regards to Indigenous populations and what their rights are and what power they have. And there's so much work that we need to do there continually. And I think because we're in Scotland, we think we're not involved, but we still are. We own quite a lot of the objects and belongings that do not belong to us. And it's finding, well, who does it belong to, and how do you get it back to the people that it does belong to? So I'm just thinking about it from that museum perspective, but also how we don't discuss this history enough in Scotland. Another great question here from Andrew McKillop. Can I ask all the panellists, does incorporating these enslavement-dependent links significantly change the history of the clearance era Highlands? And if so, what are the really significant new understandings? And he's added, conversely, what relevance, if any, is there for the peoples and communities in place like Jamaica, Grenada or Nova Scotia by demonstrating the involvement of the Highlands and Highlanders? A version of the so what question, he's saying. Stephen, do you want to come in there first?
Yeah, I can start off. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Question as always. I would say, Andrew McKillop and Ian McKinnon have already answered the first question with a recent report. They're showing that there's crime against humanity, chattel slavery, and the profiteering from that is then creating this new slavery elite. So we're saying there's a crime against humanity contributing then to the clearance. I think that then becomes significant. The second of all, more broadly, what does this add to, the distinctive role of Scots and especially Highlanders across the Caribbean? Well, I think Scots have got away with it for far too long, and the reason for that is the umbrella of British, and it's meant that has been conflated with English. Now that with David's work and other scholars, we're really beginning to understand about how Scots were really prominent across different islands, and this has got implications. Alex Renton's book, he has done his own mea culpa, and he's advocated a form of reparations, himself the descendant of elite enslavers. So if we are beginning to see it, I don't think state-to-state reparations will happen. I don't think there's a legal or political appetite for it. It would end global capitalism and end the British and American states. But certainly if we're looking then at moral arguments and specific families, if we are now identifying and the research is progressing to such a level about Scots and Highlanders, then there really starts to be moral claims about redressing this historic injustice.
David?
I think Stephen's right. That, I mean, the primary answer to the so what question is it stops us getting away with it, and I think we have for too long, because we've hidden behind that label of English, which is very or British. So I think it's important in relation to the clearances. I mean, I think it's important that 150 years ago, Donald Sage, writing about the clearances, was saying that certainly on the east coast of Sutherland, the tacksman class had all either been in the East Indies in the army or in the West Indies, and they'd sustained themselves with money. So the background to the clearances is it also includes a class of people who I think it's on a small scale, but they've been able to partly to survive by making money there. And even in the cultural background to the clearances, to quote Rob Down, he is working for somebody who's made his money in Jamaica and come back and established himself in Sutherland. So I think it's part of the warp and weft of society before the clearances, and I think there's the influence in people who've made money coming back and implementing clearance, but it's just part of the history.
Yeah. Just from the other side of the Atlantic, I think we have to look at the Highlands as part of this. It doesn't just exist in the geographic Highlands that we're familiar with. It actually extends all over the place, and that's what we have to start doing. So over here, I'm thinking that it accelerated the process of settler colonialism. And what that did was it allowed the establishment of communities that worked to through various channels, include some and exclude others when it came to establishing colonial power structures that then became provincial ones, that then became national ones. And the Scots worked very hard, the Scots Catholics that I look at worked very hard to push against the Irish, to push against the Mi'kmaq, to push against the Irish Catholics. And so it's a huge, huge thing. And it is relevant. And because maybe I feel it more acutely because I am in Canada, and we are, a mirror is being held up to all of us right now, where we have to think about the effect that all of this has had on the Indigenous peoples. And you will all know the statues of Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, Highland descent, Scot, are being torn down all over the country. Why is that happening? He was one of the architects of the residential school system. How did he get over here? It is a legacy of the clearances. Yes, it changes the history of the clearance era Highlands.
And I think your point is really important in highlighting that hierarchy of oppression, isn't it? It's like, how does that play out today? For instance, when we're having conversations about Scotland, for instance, being colonised or the coloniser. And this is something that I think all the people on the panel here will see in social media. They'll see the pushback about the whataboutery. Has anybody got any thoughts about that? Like, do you think the more we highlight our involvement, our history, do you think we'll start seeing people being more accepting of Scotland's involvement in this, in our history around slavery? Sorry.
More accepting?
Do you think they'll be more accepting and realise, because there's we keep seeing it shift, don't we? We keep seeing, okay, but what about this and what about us and what about the Highland Clearances and what about white slaves, all of that stuff. Yeah. I'd like to think that through these conversations we'll start to see the change, but do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've read David's book, and David he's got a critique of civic nationalism in general and the Scottish National Party government in particular. I mean, I see it a bit different. I see that, I mean, there's a fringe element, particularly online, who see Scotland as a colony and see themselves as slaves or ancestors of white slaves. So, but I mean, the Scottish National Party have been in since 2007, and we need to see that there has been some improvement since then. I mean, we know there's an SNP administration in Glasgow launched a study, Renfrew in Edinburgh. Arguably, they were jumping on a moving bus. but there has been some, reaction by the SNP moderates. So we're seeing that there's an acceptance. And what I would say, there's a change in intellectual climate. The historiography's improved. There's a general anti-racist society throughout, or at least it's improving in Scotland. So there's a number of different international debates that are combining, and I think Scotland is actually, I think Scotland was well behind in 2001 when the Glasgow Anti-Racist Alliance first started lobbying in this, but in Scotland, I think, is ahead of the game. And what's interesting is the real criticisms you see in England, such as the Common Sense group of Tory MPs, the attacks in Corinne Fill and the National Trust, we don't seem to see that in Scotland. So for the idea that civic nationalism submerges and censors, it's not really what I'm seeing in the ground. I certainly think that there's a political will for change.
I think, sorry, David, go.
Yeah, I think it maybe need to explain that. I think what I'm attacking or critiquing is an idea of civic nationalism that relies on an idea that somehow there is something inherently more fair and more just about Scots, and that it runs in the blood or in the veins, which was part of the independence campaign, the referendum campaign. So I think civic. I think it's clearly important that there is a commitment to justice, and I think part of that should be a commitment to reparation, not because of how much we've benefited, but because of the harm that we've done. And I think that's the key to reparations.
Yeah.
But we need to be engaged in the discussions, and there's been some great movements. I think Glasgow University's led the way in making academic links. We're still not talking about reparations. We're not engaged in the discussions.
Well, my response to that would be then, in the way I think about it, the British state have already kiboshed us. Tony Blair and New Labour, Durban 2001, leading up to 2007, they've put up legal and political barriers. Why then is there a moral case for a devolved Scotland that has no capacity to do this? We know you're making a moral argument here that the Scottish is a critique of the Scottish government you're putting forward when the British state have already kiboshed it. So I don't mean to be obstructive. I'm just pointing out the legal and political realities here of a devolved Scotland. Scotland isn't independent.
I think we have to not get complacent about this work, actually, because while there is interest in it at the moment, we know that can turn and change very quickly, and something else could become more prominent. And that just made me think about the conversation you and I had, Carly, about Canada and the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you want to elaborate a wee bit on that, like what you're feeling is happening in Canada?
Yeah, I suppose it's not dissimilar to what's happening over there, but it really did cause a lot of people to pause and reflect. There were a lot of protests. There was a lot of frustration and anger. My students were upset. They were protesting. They were talking about it. On top of that, we had our Truth and Reconciliation Commission before that about the residential schools where the Indigenous children were stolen from their families. And then there were graves that were discovered, unmarked graves. Mm-hmm. And so there is an awful lot happening at the moment where I feel like we are in this really important space where we can pick a path, and either we go down the path of trying to figure out what the truths are, or we can be blind to them like we have been in the past. I know that I'm going to be on that side, the figuring out what the truths can be. And what I would say about this research in Scotland, I agree with Stephen. I think that Scotland is quite ahead of the game in many respects, certainly more ahead than I would say Canada is. Working on this stuff in Scotland with colleagues there has been actually very supportive. There has been an awful lot of collaboration. There has been an awful lot of information sharing. And I don't know that happens to the extent that it should elsewhere. And so I think that, that's quite a positive thing to take from all of this, that there is an impetus for working together on this and taking it forward and not dropping the ball. I hope that in Canada we can kind of follow the lead a little bit more. We just our big funding council just this past 6 months made the first big funding for Black people's history of Canada, because there wasn't one, right? And if Black Lives Mattered hadn't have happened, that funding, I don't know that they would have been as supportive. So these things can spark change, and then it's up to the research community to work with our students and our communities, right? Nothing is really going to change if we don't bring the communities with us. It's up to us to keep going.
And I agree. I feel when we look at this, it's actually having community at the centre of it, not in the periphery. And I see that even in academia, you know, it's like adding the community on, but actually we have to work collaboratively together, share expertise and knowledge, and ensuring that we keep this the agenda of learning about this history forward, because it does have an impact, actually. It does have an impact on the ground, particularly for visible minorities in Scotland and elsewhere. So there's another couple of questions which I can squeeze in before we finish up. I can't believe how quickly the time is passing. So Juanita has asked a question. Juanita Cox is asking, is there a connection between media ownership and businesses financed through slavery and hence the silences? So what they mean is, I mean, the long history of textual silence. So
yeah, I would say so. I mean, we know that certainly there's complicity with the Glasgow Courier, for example, in the slavery period. You know, they employ James McQueen, who becomes a colonial demagogue and putting forward pro-slavery arguments up to emancipation in 1834. Post-emancipation, certainly in a Glasgow specific, I would interpret media ownership broader and say that many of these second generation and third generation slavery elites then become lawyers, and they're writing skewed accounts, such as the old country houses, the old Glasgow gentry, and then obscuring their ancestors' role, their direct fathers and grandfathers' roles. They're putting euphemisms in that is just shaping where the family fortune came from. So definitely, I mean, the privilege that comes with, the elite privilege that comes with wealth is allowing them to shape the conversation into the Victorian period, absolutely.
Anyone else get any thoughts about that?
I think Stephen's right. I think there's also an element of some of the money that's being made is being reinvested in things like art galleries. There's a sort of cultural capital that's derived from this that people then don't want to look at where that's come from. So the founding collection of Kelvin Grove Art Gallery came from a big slave. Big family who enslaved people.
Do you have anything to add, Carly?
Not on that one, no.
Just wanted to make sure that you weren't getting left out there. I mean, it's everywhere. It's all around us, isn't it? It's in plain sight, and yet it's taken how long for us to get to this point where, we're celebrating Black History Month, but as we know, 1 month a year is not. It's never been right, and it's never been correct. And the fact that we're seeing these sort of discussions happen every month of the year now in Scotland is actually really, forward. It's a step forward for sure. So the last question, and I'll kind of elaborate on it a wee bit, is Sarah Crome is saying, do you think that some of the streets in Glasgow should be renamed, such as Jamaica Street? I don't have a strong opinion, just wondered the panel's opinion. But I'm just going to add a caveat to that, because a big part of the public discussion is around street names and statues. And on a personal level, sometimes I feel that takes is away from what the real work of this is about and the anti-racist elements of it. What does the panel think about that, about the way the discussion is being perpetuated in the media around statues and street names? Carla, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I know that there's been some work around that in Canada also.
Yeah, there has. The example that I'll provide again relates to the Mi'kmaq, and where there was a big statue to Edward Cornwallis, who's declared the founder of Halifax, and this statue was removed last year, and there was some uproar about that, and people that were really frustrated about that statue coming down. They didn't stop to think it was actually put up in the 20th century, but they also, I don't think, stopped to think about how that statue made Mi'kmaq feel when they saw it every day, because this man actually introduced a policy of scalping Mi'kmaq people. And that was still on the statute books. And so there has to be a sensitivity to that. And, you know, for a white female historian to sort of stop and think, it's really not about what I feel. It's me stopping to listen to what other voices are telling me right now. In terms of street names, that's an interesting question because, you know, when I first moved to Glasgow in 1998, I was really curious about these street names because I didn't know where they were coming from. And it made me kind of curious, like, why is there a Jamaica Street here? Like, where did it come from? And part of me wonders, will people still be curious and question? And then will it make them rethink what they thought Glasgow looked like or what other cities looked like? So these are all things that are going on in my mind. Other people have way better arguments about it than me. But I was certainly, in Halifax at least, in favor of that Cornwallis statue coming down. And now it's the Peace and Friendship Park for little kids and families. And really, you know, it's not about us, it's about the next generations. So they're coming up. What are we going to do for them?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Carly. You know, even looking at my own ancestry and some of the statues that I have to walk past that have sacked Indian cities, and it's actually very traumatic. The street names I'm not so bothered about because I do think they're there for questioning, but the statues actually we could do without. I'm dead conscious of time, so if Stephen and David have any comment on that last question, then we can finish on that. Do you want to come in on that about the statues and street names, David?
I agree with Carly. I suppose on a statue that I do feel I've got a right to comment about, which is the Duke of Sutherland, partly because it's Scottish Highland history and I was brought up underneath it. I would leave it and talk about it rather than knock it down. Although there was a point in my life when I remember plotting to do something to it.
You could have been ahead of the game there, David, if you had done that.
Well, I should say, I mean, I need to add a comment then about that. I should say I'm undertaking an audit of street names at the moment and statues in Glasgow, so I do not have a formal position on changing, but it's certainly become a lightning rod. You know, there's a Virginia Street, Glassford Street, Ingram Street, and there's actually a Merchant City, which was named in 1990. That's a new phenomenon, which is arguably a modern glorification of Glasgow's merchants. So it has kept, to me, the streets are integral because they have became this lightning rod, and it meant in 2001 when Glasgow Anti-Racist Alliance started their slavery tour, then promoted this, really the consciousness, put it into the popular consciousness, and should they well, we know Professor Sir Jeff Palmer argues they shouldn't be changed because they're important evidence themselves. Lawrence Westgarth, historian of Liverpool, is the exact same. He does Black History tours, and he says if you're removing the evidence, you're removing the deed. So, I mean, there is different on it.
Okay, thank you very much. Folk are starting to throw questions in now, but I'm sorry, we've ran out of time. And I should remind everybody that Glasgow Anti-Racist Alliance is now CRER, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, who has been working in this area for such a long time now. I just want to thank you all, the panel. Thank you to Stephen, thank you to David, and thank you to Carly for all your papers this evening and interesting conversation. Really sparked a lot of thoughts even for myself and going forward with my work. And thank you to the audience for participating tonight, and to everyone who put a question forward. So thank you very much. Hope we can do this again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye from Canada, everybody. Bye. Bye.